Welcome back. Let's bring into the conversation Dr. Jakkie Cilliers from the Institute for Security Studies. He says we mustn't expect too much from these recent arrests. Dr. Cilliers, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. So it took a while to get things going. I mean, there was the initial burst of arrests that we saw last year. And then there was just silence, and people were wondering, are we really going to have about 350 people dead and no accountability whatsoever by way of people standing trial at the very least? And then suddenly we see this burst of action. What do you make of it all?
Well, I think it's to be welcomed. Of course, South Africans are looking for accountability. We've seen the arrests, but I think the arrests, from the beginning, I felt that that's not really going to really satisfy South Africans. What is much more important is fixing the structural problems that gave within the intelligence and the security agencies that allowed the situation to get out of hand. And the report by Professor Sandy Africa listed a host of recommendations, mostly relating to coordination, but fixing in particularly the early warning system and the coordination within the top executive level within government. Now, we don't know how much of that has been implemented, but we have seen some action with regard to the appointment of capable, competent senior people to positions such as the National Police Commissioner and within intelligence. But I know that South Africans want much more to happen, but those fixing is probably more important.
Yeah, and you make a good point about fixing the various structures of intelligence that Professor Sandy Africa and her panel alluded to. But it does link to these arrests, though. Much of what we know at this point has to do with what the investigators were able to harvest from social media accounts. Not to knock that, because I don't know much about intelligence, but does that tell you that the intelligence and investigative capabilities are starting to grind and are starting to be fine-tuned, particularly in as far as focus on this issue is concerned, or was that always an easy win? Anyone can go and join a WhatsApp group or ask a question of a person who's a member of a WhatsApp group and say, what were you discussing? Please share the screenshots with me.
I think there is a huge difference between the provision of intelligence for early warning to preempt and the provision of evidence that will stand up in a court of law. I think that what we are now busy with is the latter. So government, the various agencies must find evidence that will hold up in court, and proving conspiracy, proving a causality between somebody said something and that resulted in action is extremely difficult. So I would separate the two. Fixing what we have, the problems of bringing people to justice, that requires effective detective work. It doesn't really require intelligence. It requires that the capacities that are there with regard to forensics and so on, that they operate. So for me, these are largely two separate issues. Yeah. Fixing the intelligence systems and prosecuting the people and bringing that to a court that will stand up in a court of law.
And within that investigative element, as opposed to preemptive intelligence and preventative intelligence work, in the investigative space, how important is the ability to make those links between social media, the ability to investigate and go behind identities of people, for instance, on social media, but also going into various WhatsApp groups and creating a thread and a narrative that can be presented in court? I read somewhere in the Sowetan Live, Dr. Cilliers, the point that you make, and I had not really thought of it that way, that many people, for instance, are talking about how Duduzile Zuma Sambudla is not one of the people who have been arrested. And you make a point to say, actually, you've got to know your story. What is it that you're calling for her to be arrested for?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the point. We know that the police has invested significantly in a very high technology capacity, but we also know that they don't appear to be able to utilize a lot of that capacity. You'll remember about the stories of the grabbers and so on. We also know that the police are struggling to be able to harvest stuff, for example, from WhatsApp, given the levels of encryption and so on and so forth. But I say again, the problem of somebody tweeting something and creating a direct link between that and the subsequent action, because a lot of the tweeting that we've seen was really celebratory. Yes, fantastic, carry on, whatever. But creating a causal link, I think, is very difficult. I don't think that government really is on top of that issue, because it is about fixing the relationship between the National Prosecuting Authority and the police and and those kind of relationships, so that your investigation goes seamlessly into a case that will stand up in a court of law, and that require the bar for that is very, very high. So I'm not holding my breath that we will see significant prosecution for the July riots. What I really hope to see is that government will implement the recommendations from the Sandy Africa report and fix what is very clearly a broken intelligence system, really in a sense a broken criminal justice system, and focus on, in many senses, the basics within intelligence, police, the military,
Sure.
that allow all of this to have happened.
So that is the antidote, Dr. Cilliers, and I appreciate your focus on it, and I'm with you 100% on that. But also on the questions of peeling off the layers of what happened. So a sort of backwards looking approach, investigative and analytical approach to it all. When you look at the charges that these people are facing, for instance, there's 34, as well as the earlier 19 that had been named by Police Minister Jakkie Cilliers in Parliament, I don't see any charges here that are sort of, talk to the high watermark of the allegation at the time of a failed insurrection, charges that would go into the protection of constitutional democracy against terrorist acts, or whatever the framing of that act is. You're really not seeing a Buramach style kind of thing, trial, you're sort of coming together here, are you?
Yeah. No, and I don't think you will, because proving a conspiracy, proving that kind of issue is very difficult. Remember the old story about Al Capone. What eventually they got Al Capone on was tax evasion. And I think that you need to go to court with what you can prove. And what you can prove is very difficult, very different from what you suspect, and what you are looking at this sort of grand conspiracy. What you do is you pick the low-hanging fruit, the thing that you can prove. And I think that in South Africa, the extent of the conspiracy, the extent of the insurrection that we saw, there's a lot of talk about it, but nobody's really been able to put it together in terms of who are the real instigators that were fingered, and where is the proof. I personally don't think we're going to see that. I think we're going to see some little fish being hauled in front of the courts, slap on the wrist. I'm afraid that the extent of damage that has been done to detective services, the prosecution services that we're trying to fix, is such that I don't think they had the capability really to investigate and to bring this to court in an effective manner. I'm hoping that this is a lesson that will change going forward, but I'm not too hopeful that we're going to see the big fish you're speaking about. I don't think they're going to be prosecuted.
Yeah, because just reading from the charges that these people are set to face, they largely center around inciting people to public violence, etc. It's a serious crime, don't get me wrong, but it's a long way off from insurrection and really threatening the democratic states. So lastly then, Dr. Cilliers, if I'm hearing you correctly, it would be more useful and productive for us as South Africans to focus our energies towards ensuring that there's accountability to the extent that there's not been implementation of the various findings, whether be it from the Marikana report around policing in this country, Dr. Sidney Mufamadi's report, the Sandy Africa report, and now the, whatever comes out of the processes that the Human Rights Commission, for instance, has been investigating around this matter. Also coupled this with everything we're seeing in the deteriorating security situation as evidenced by the crime stats.
I think that you're exactly right. Those are the things we should be looking at. South Africa is facing a difficult period, and particularly given what's happening within the governing party, but also because of unemployment and poor governance and corruption, and just generally people are desperate. So we need to fix the security agencies, and that fixing does not really lie in bringing more blue men in uniform into the streets. It's really about fixing the basic management stuff, fixing the detective services, forensics, firearms control, and the ability to prosecute, to hold evidence together. So the working between the NPA and the police and so on, those are the things. And some of that is very difficult to trace, but that is much more important. There are signs that that is happening. The new National Police Commissioner has made some important announcements, and it will take time to fix some of these basic issues. But I think, that's much more important.
All right, I've got to thank you for your time and your insights here on eNCA. That's Dr. Jakkie Cilliers from the Institute for Security Studies weighing in on our Sunday Focus. Stand by in a moment. The parting shots from our reporters Siphamandla Goge, Govan Whittles, as well as Dasin Tatia on this particular topic.